started. So Twitter and social media have really occupied a central place in many recent protest movements, really starting with the Occupy demonstrations in the United States back in 2011 and 2012, then moving through the Tahrir protests in Egypt in 2013, the Gezi Park protests in Turkey also in 2013, and then as well as the Euromaidan protests in 2013-2014, which I'll focus on today. So these various social movements have really sparked considerable scholarly attention on the usage of social media during periods of civil unrest, as well as interest in the social and political insights that might be gained from conducting analysis on large social media data sets. So studies of Twitter usually limit their analysis to the textual and network aspects of Twitter itself, which are more easily machine processed. And they often set aside visual materials that are attached and read in tweets, because these usually have to be human read. And for this reason, I've chosen to focus specifically on these images that circulate within the Twitter network during the Euromaidan protests. And I'm doing this in order to gain an understanding both of the production and the consumption of images as cultural artifacts during these periods of social unrest and protest. Tweeted images are qualitatively quite different from a text-only post. Users often turn to images to expand on what they're saying in their post or to make particular points or political arguments, as well as to provide documentary evidence of events. And so this makes these images especially rich sources for understanding the real-time processes of social movements. So I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with the Maidan protests, but to just go over the timeline a little bit as an introduction. So the protests began on November 21st, 2013 in Kiev's Maidan Square in response to the suspension of the government's negotiations finalizing the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, which was intended to foster greater economic and social integration between the EU and Ukraine. And it appears that the protest began with a Facebook post by the journalist Mustafa Nayam asking people to come out on the square. This began then as a small gathering primarily of journalists, activists, and students. And participants in the protest began using the Euromaidan hashtag, both in Ukrainian, in Russian, and in English. And they used it across several different social networks: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, various other places. So the protest began to grow over the next week, and then on the 30th of November, the square was forcibly cleared by Ukraine's special security troops, the Berkut, using the excuse of installing a traditional Christmas tree that's in the square. And this really radicalized the protests and switched the emphasis from the EU negotiations to direct opposition of the Yanukovych government. So it shifted away from EU politics to really focusing on Ukraine's internal politics. Moving forward to January 16th, there was a passage of fairly draconian anti-protest laws banning things like helmets, putting 10-year jail terms for people blocking government buildings, driving vans, convoys of more than 5 cars, mandatory registration of mobile phones, and so forth. And this really intensified the protests, and clashes started happening immediately after, beginning on January 19th on Hrushchevskoye Street, and these resulted in the first deaths on January 21st through 23rd. And this cycle of standoffs, punctuated by violent confrontations between the protesters and government forces in and around the Maidan, really came to characterize this protest movement. And this cycle culminated in the clashes of February 18th, which resulted in the deaths of over 100 people, as police units and snipers surrounding the square resorted to using live ammunition. So there's been at least 130 confirmed deaths altogether. This resulted in the ousting of President Viktor Yanukovych, who was then impeached and charged with mass murder by the new government. He, of course, fled to Russia. And then the crisis entered a new phase on February 27th, when Russian military units began occupying the Crimean Peninsula. First at strategic locations, such as the airports and government buildings, and then expanding to the entire region March 1st. And then we all know that things didn't improve after that. So just so that we're all on the same page, I'm going to use a little bit of technical vocabulary about Twitter throughout this presentation. So just for those of you who may not be totally familiar with Twitter, Twitter is a microblogging platform in which people post 140-character tweets that come with the ability to embed media. These are almost 100% public. There is a direct messaging function that you can use, but if you're not sending it to a specific person, these are public. And they're archived at the Library of Congress, but right now that's a dark archive. It's theoretically open to research, but they haven't yet approved anyone to actually do the research at the Library of Congress. So the basic unit is this 140-character maximum tweet. People have followers, so these are the people who will receive the tweet that you send. And then people also have friends, and this is a little confusing. Friends are the people that you follow, so the people that you get tweets from. So this graphic kind of shows the three different kinds of relationships. In Twitter, if this, this center one here is you can be getting things from people, you can be sending and receiving things from people, and then you can also be sending things out. So there's differences in what people see. So a retweet is sending a copy, sometimes with edits, of another person's tweet, and then hashtags are used, which are this # plus a descriptor. And this was actually invented by users on Twitter to allow searching for particular themes. This becomes really important when we start trying to do analysis of Twitter. So the big things to remember are a post is original content, a retweet is content that you've gotten from somewhere else and then sent along into your network, and then the hashtags are the way to track these things. So a little bit on what Twitter usage looks like in Ukraine. As of 2012, and it's the estimates are quite frankly quite hard to get at. Twitter doesn't release much of its data. As of 2012, there was about 500,000 Twitter users in Ukraine, and unfortunately, I don't have more recent numbers. In terms of users per 100,000 people in 2013, and that's the graph here, Ukraine ranks fairly low in the bottom half in terms of usage. Poland's actually even a little lower. So Twitter is kind of a middle social network, I would say, in Ukraine. Facebook, Virtual Contact, and others are more widespread. So when we compare this to really high usage countries, you can see Kuwait has one person per, it's ranked number one, and has 100 users per 100,000, and then Ukraine has more like, is like a factor of 10 less. And the United States is up near the top as well. However, Twitter usage is growing in Ukraine and grew throughout the protests, and it's probably grown quite a bit because of usage during the protest. So this first graph shows new Twitter accounts created in Ukraine, and so we see that there's peaks, especially right now in 2014 when the protests were at their height, and then also in July, that's of 2014, when once the war in the East really started, we see a lot of communication on Twitter involving that. And then finally, the orange bars on the bottom chart show the tweets on the most active day of the month, and then blue show the average tweets in a month. And so again, we see that over time, Twitter appears to be growing in importance in Ukraine. And these are the creation of the accounts by region in 2013 to 2014. So we see the conflict areas in the east and around Kyiv as the places where the most accounts are being created, as well as the west, which is, of course, very strongly nationalist. So Twitter seems to be increasing in popularity. It's right now the 23rd most popular site in Ukraine, and it's stayed at this point for the last 2 or 3 years. So a kind of middle social network, but growing, and fairly important, I think, to younger people and to people who were involved in the protest movement. Okay, so focusing in on my particular analysis. So for this analysis, I obtained a data set from GNIP, which is Twitter's exclusive data partner. And this consisted of all tweets containing an image and tagged with one of the 4 Euromaidan hashtags, in Ukrainian, in Russian, or in English, and then the one Maidan, which is kind of more universal. And I obtained these between January 16th and February 24th, 2014. I chose this time period because it includes the most intensive periods of protest and violence associated with the movement, but it excludes tweets that were associated with the subsequent crisis in Crimea and the later Russian invasion. Because I think that shifted the focus of this movement and really shifted the focus of the political crisis to something else. So I wanted to bracket that out. So altogether, this data set contains about 880,000 tweets. About 100,000 of those, or a little over 10%, are original posts, and about 88% are retweets. And altogether, it contains 70,000 unique image URLs. So processing this was very time-consuming and very complicated. Twitter delivers raw format data that has to be processed, but I'll spare you the details of a month or two of my life for now. From an ethnographer standpoint, though, this data set is also fairly problematic, most obviously because of the sheer volume. It really defies traditional anthropological approaches, because just viewing each post for 1 second would take more than 10 days working nonstop for 24 hours a day. And so any attempt at coding or a content analysis of the full data set was really a non-starter. The data is also difficult because it's contextually rather thin. Twitter provides limited metadata about the user's posting, and it forces us to really make inferences from only the content of tweets and a few user-generated data fields. So it's very difficult to determine the demographics about Twitter users, and it's almost impossible to obtain specific information about how many Twitter users are in Ukraine or elsewhere, or really how representative it is of the population. It almost certainly isn't representative of the population. It definitely skews towards younger people and more technologically savvy individuals. So for this reason, I chose to pursue an exploratory mixed methods approach that combines qualitative and quantitative measures with the goal of developing an understanding of the data's meaning. So some people have called this approach cultural analytics, especially the strategy of using visualizations as a way to explore large data sets. And I like to think of it as using quantitative techniques to obtain qualitative insights about cultural materials. And like other anthropological endeavors, the subjectivity of the researcher remains a central component of these kind of approaches. None of these organizing techniques is neutral, and judgment calls have to always be made about how to interpret or emphasize particular patterns within the data. And different approaches may reveal or conceal different patterns. So through the remainder of the presentation, I'd like to work through a series of these techniques with particular emphasis on understanding the types of users posting the images, the languages being used, and the location of where the tweets originated, as well as the content of the images and the text. And I'll work my way from a macroscopic level down to the level of individual users and individual posts. So beginning with what the users looked like within our data set. So there were a little over 20,000 unique users contributing to this data set. But a relatively small number of user accounts account for a disproportionate percentage of the images posted. And so these are all 20,000 accounts, and the size of the bubble is the number of posts within the data set. So as you can see, this skews towards a relatively small number of highly active users, and then a lot of people who participate at a much lower level. So the mean number of posts was 5, and the median was 1. So many people are only appearing a couple times within the data set. And about 93% of the total data set posted less than 10 times. So it really is heavy around a relatively small number of accounts. And so these accounts had a very, very wide range of followers. The max number of followers was 1.8 million. The lowest number of followers was just a handful. The mean number of followers is a little over 2,000. But the standard deviation is rather large, and this has really important impacts for how we try to understand the impact of particular images within the network. And I'll come back to this a bit more later. So these are the top 12 accounts that were content posting. And of these top 12 accounts, 4 were accounts managed by activist organizations, 2 by individual activists, 1 by a documentary webcam bot, 1 by a spam bot, and then 4 by individuals who could not be readily identified as activists or non-activists. And so I think these figures really suggest the merging of media outlets and policy activism, which I think is a key feature of the Euromaidan protest movement. So getting into the specifics of the tweets. The language used in the original posts were almost evenly divided into 4 groups. Russian at 25%, Ukrainian at 21%, English at 30%, and then all the other languages combined at 24%. And this distribution is fairly similar to other studies of Euromaidan Twitter usage, and I think reflects the combination of Kyiv's status as a bilingual city, as well as the international character of interest in the protest. Especially Twitter's user base that skews towards English. And so the prevalence of English in the language use distribution, I think, also reflects activists' specific efforts to engage in the international community by choosing to tweet in English. So trying to guide the narrative about these protests. So this graph shows the volume of tweets by language over the course of the data set, and we see, again, the peaks during the periods of violence right before January 23rd and then around February 18th. And so we see the relative distribution of the 3 languages remains relatively consistent throughout the data set. So in terms of location, it's very, very difficult to determine the location from which a particular Twitter posts originate. Very few users turn on Twitter's geolocating functionality, only about 2% of the total users. So we're really forced to estimate based on self-reported information. About 40% of the posts in this data set contain location information in the user profile. And of these, 62% indicated a location in Ukraine, about 30% in Kyiv, and about 15% indicated a location in Russia. And so that's only of the posts. The totals are, of course, less than that. No other country accounted for more than 1% of the total, but we really have to exercise a lot of caution in extrapolating from this self-reported metadata, because a lot of it really is blank. But it does appear that a large number of users that were contributing images to the data set were located in Ukraine and in Kyiv, although it's impossible to ascertain from this information whether or not particular users were directly participating in the protests, and if they were posting their own images or if they were circulating images that they had found elsewhere. And there's quite a lot of evidence for the latter. So moving into strategies for visualization. This visualization shows the entire data set organized by brightness and color hue, so all 75,000 images or so. And so as we can see from this, in very broad terms, there's 2 distinct bands, a blue band and an orange band. The blue band corresponds to Ukrainian national colors, and the orange band corresponds to really fires and a lot of violent imagery. So this kind of plot can tell us some broad things, but in order to get a more representative survey of the types of images, I took a random sample of 483 of these posts as a representative sample of the unique URLs, and constructed a data set to run a more traditional content analysis of the image and the text of the associated tweet. And this is what that data set looks like. So it follows the same volume pattern as the rest of the data set. And so this provided us with a survey of the types of images that were circulated in the Twitter network, as well as a good general measure of what people felt was worth posting publicly. And I think there's a really important aspect of performativity here within Twitter, and this is what some people have called active showing, or demonstrating the things that people consider worth sharing into the network. And I think it's worth understanding what people choose to share, even if it's not what winds up being publicly consumed. The act of posting something to Twitter or to other public forums is important, even if there's only a few followers to actually receive the message. And at one extreme, even if one has no followers, a tweet into the network is a public event because it's going out into this public data set and into this archive data set. And so I think that this kind of symbolic action is important as real action. So our analysis discovered several patterns that might be expected from a protest data set. About 25% or a quarter of the images showed some sort of violence or the potential for violence, including the very dramatic images that I'm sure you've all seen, things like the barricades, the fires, the police lines that have become associated with the Euromaidan protests. I'm sure you've all seen this in various media sources. Many other images were reused or borrowed from other media sources, and this was one of the things that was really interesting in this data set, such as live streaming internet television services. So many of the posts to Twitter were just screenshots of the live cast from internet television services. And so this, I think, provides a really important public record of the protests themselves. And it also allows people to move beyond the character limits within Twitter. So this borrowing and remixing of images was really important aspect of the Euromaidan conversation on Twitter. And about 16% of the total images were edited or reused in some way. And so these included things like memes, which attempted humor or satire, images that highlighted or called out specific aspects of other images, like this one pointing out the stun grenade. And then there were also things that were that tried to provide political commentary. The one I passed. Screenshots from other social media to get around the character limits of Twitter. And then also things that were blatantly misinformation. So this is an edited image trying to associate the protest with the Nazi Party, and this is a completely faked image that was circulating within the data set. And so fully one-fifth of the images were these kind of remixed images. So 20% were jokes, satire, commentary, and these kind of things are often lost in the noise of all of these other images of violence and protests that we see within other media outlets. So when we're dealing with images circulated on Twitter, we really also need to take the network into account. So posted images are not, of course, all equally viewed or circulated. So if the choice to share is a first filter by the individual, the things that the network makes visible is a second filter. And attention here is a key resource for social movements. And so this is when some of the visualization strategies for this data set really come in. So there's many, many different ways to look at the consumption or the potential of consumption of these types of images. And so first, I created a visualization that ranked the images by the total number of times they appeared in the data set. And that's this montage here. And I'll bring up a more detailed image. of just the first few images in this data set. And so this data set, by the volume, the number of times it appears within our data, really focuses on violent images. So things like the victims, things like the direct conflict with the police, the snipers, and so forth. But also, there's this image that circulated very frequently, and this is actually from earlier in the data set. This is the hanging of the flag on the Christmas tree at the end of November. So this was an image that really continued to circulate throughout the data set. So this is one way of identifying these types of images. So next, I ranked the images by the total number of retweets within the data set. And so we start here to see edits and commentary added to the images. And so this will skew towards things that appeared early in the data set and things that lasted long in the data set. So whereas the previous images were just a measure of the total number of times, this now starts to focus on how long something stays within the Twitter network, as well as how many people engage with it. So we see that now these kind of commentary or edited images start appearing more often, especially in the first few images. But there's some broad similarities. So that this picture appears again, and then we also see this image, which I'm sure you'll probably run into in other media, of the square before and after the clashes. But so when we compare these side by side, now we can see that the total retweets and the total volume really do look fairly similar. And so this is a real nice way, I think, of juxtaposing these larger data sets in a way that you can compare them fairly quickly and fairly easily, and then decide whether or not it's worth doing more detailed content analysis. So next I tried to take the audience into account. And this montage ranks the total number of followers of the people posting and retweeting. And so this will favor images from accounts with large number of followers. So things like politicians' accounts, corporate accounts, and so forth, media accounts. And so again, we see in terms of the total number of audience, an emphasis on these very dramatic and violent images. But the one that went out to the most people was actually a visualization of where people were tweeting about Euromaidan, and that actually went out via the Twitter corporate account, which has almost 2 million followers by itself. So we'll really weight these images heavily based on people who are well connected within a network. Okay, so moving forward then with these visualizations, there's many different approaches to trying to figure out exactly which images are being seen and being posted by different audiences and different users. So I really wanted to figure out what was the core representation of the data set, and I call this the high engagement images. So first, I required that the image be posted into the data set at least 50 times. At least 100 times. And so this helps balance for accounts that have a lot of followers but only have 1 or 2 tweets within the data set. So a lot of these were politicians' accounts, especially U.S. politicians around February, all started tweeting this 1 or 2 images to millions of followers. So I wanted to remove those because those people weren't really engaged in the Twitter conversation beyond that. And then I also limited it to tweets that went out to at least 100,000 total followers. So things that a lot of people saw. And then finally, I limited the standard deviation of the number of followers to less than 10,000. So I wanted it to be a measure of the central users within the data set. So this will remove the users like Twitter, which has 2 million followers, and it'll also remove the posts that tend to be with people that only have a handful of followers. And so then I plotted this by the time that the tweet occurred, and then just in order to get some visual separation by the color, the dominant color within the data set. And so we can see that there are, again, these two peaks around the time of violence in January, and on the right-hand side around the time of violence in February. So we can see that there's 4 clusters here. So then we can explore what sorts of things are appearing in these clusters of information. And now we see that there's a lot more to these data sets besides just the examples of these violent imagery or the clashes. So there's a lot of, again, a lot of commentary, things that are photographs of more peaceful aspects of the demonstration. We see the Ukrainian and the EU flags as symbols a lot. We see these maps appear, these maps of Ukraine, and the things that were happening in different parts of Ukraine become very important. Again, there is the clashes. And so we see that there's many, many different things going on in these conversations beyond just what's happening on the square. And then we also see Yanukovych's mansion and cars and so forth start to appear towards the end of this data set. So as we look at these in more detail, we see that these violent images that were so prevalent in other media contexts kind of fall out of this data set, and it starts becoming more about other things that are going on, other ways that people are experiencing this. And so then to conclude, I wanted to explore whether or not these techniques could be used to identify differences between individuals posting on Twitter during the Euromaidan. And so I started graphing individual users, the tweets of high engaged individual users, both as a montage over time. So this is the data set from left to right, top to bottom of this individual user's account, and then also plotting it in the same way by color and by time. And so we can start to see pretty readily in these accounts how individual users were engaging. So this person is an activist, part of the Russia's Occupy movement, and so we can see the bands within this data set of the nights and the clashes. This one now is a map of the documentary bot that was on Khrushchevskoye Street, and so here we can see an entirely different pattern of what was happening. And of course, this was because this particular account was just auto-tweeting. And so we can see these distinct bands of color that correspond to different times of day. The white images are when the camera actually wasn't working. And so we can see this cycle from day to night over time. So if we didn't know in advance what sort of account this is, this would be a strategy for learning about what type of individual this is. This is the Euromaidan activist organization. And so as we look at this, we can see the register of this is much more white in it than either of these two. So this tells us that there's probably something worth exploring within this account compared to the others. And what these images actually are informational documents about things that were happening, where to bring supplies, various other things. And they used a standard format of red and white to post these images, and so we can identify those very readily in this sort of data set. And then finally, this is, unlike the others which were high posting accounts, this is a high retweeting account. An individual who is I believe, interested in the Euromaidan, but not present. And we see that this person, whereas the other accounts really peak around the periods of, in this band, the periods of conflict, this account is much more engaged across time in a more regular pattern. So a different type of engagement can be identified here. So then the question becomes, so these people we know are quite engaged, or these accounts, in the case of Euromaidan, this might be more than one person. But the question then becomes, do these images that they're posting into Twitter get out into the broader Twitter network? And we can see for a couple of these, the answer is yes. For the spin-off account, almost 10% wound up in that high engagement data set. And in Euromaidan, 16% ended up in that high engagement data set. So these accounts were really quite effective in getting their images out into the broader network. And then in terms of the number of followers who actually saw the account, 22 of the spin-off account actually got out to more than 1 million accounts, and 10 of the Euromaidan. So again, fairly effective. And then the documentary account at Khrushchevskoye only got a handful of images out. But again, the purpose of that account was probably more to create a public record than to circulate things within the network. And so this is montages of the 1 million plus images that went out through these two accounts. Okay, so what can we make of all of these different approaches to analysis? The images and the associated text within the tweets of this data set really, I think, serve two central purposes. First, to provide documentation of events, and second, to provide commentary on the politics and the policies surrounding the Euromaidan movement. By the time the protest data was collected, which was almost 2 months after the initial demonstration, I think the Euromaidan hashtags were no longer being used for coordination purposes among protesters, probably because the volume of traffic had rendered them no longer effective for that purpose. I think that most of that had shifted to other social networks. Twitter posts also don't seem to be especially concerned with vetting or evaluating information, practices that have moved on to blogs covering Euromaidan and the subsequent conflicts in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So instead, I think many of these posts and images represent attempts by activists and others to structure the narrative surrounding the protests and to engage with people from outside the region. A practice that others have argued is a really powerful tool for protesters and makes Twitter an especially powerful tool for these movements. In this way, as activists in the region engage with other individuals and actors from abroad, the Euromaidan Twitter space represents a form of trans-politics, or a condition in which domestic politics and policy debates are conducted outside the confines of a nation-state, and often in ways that challenge, destabilize, or transcend traditional political structures, such as state bureaucracies, political parties, or labor unions. Indeed, within the tweets we analyzed, there was often the assertion that outside actors were playing key roles within the policies of the Yanukovych government toward the protests and in Ukrainian politics generally. In particular, President Vladimir Putin appeared in our data with a greater frequency than any other politician besides Yanukovych himself. And while the Twitter space associated with the Euromaidan protests is only one piece in a large and complex media landscape in which these movements operate, it demonstrates emerging ways in which local events become engaged with transnational networks. As a direct response to a policy decision on an international agreement, the Euromaidan movement began as an inherently transnational event, and the participants actively sought to utilize both social media to organize, to utilize social media and other media, not only to organize, but to communicate and engage with international audiences. And this form of transpolitics assumes that policy change will require support and action both from home and from abroad, and operates simultaneously in local, national, and transnational levels, and across national and linguistic borders, in a way that I think may represent a new style of social media supported and network protests. So I've covered a great deal of material, some of it probably difficult to view from the audience. So I will be very happy to have a broader discussion and answer any questions.
Thank you.